of me when you are all alone.
In October of 2008, Bethesda Game Studios released Fallout 3, and in doing so, changed the series forever. Gone were the 2D sprites, the isometric camera, and the turn-based combat of those original games in favour of something that the studio believed would appeal to a larger, more mainstream audience. And in fairness, the nearly 5 million units sold during its launch week suggest they were probably right on that front. However, even to this day, there were a substantial number of fans that lament the loss of classic Fallout. Which is why, in today's episode of Here's the Thing, we're going to take a look back at the Fallout 3 we never got to play. Often referred to as the Van Buren Project, named for the 8th President of the United States, this game was in development at Black Isle Studios during the early 2000s, but was eventually cancelled due to financial difficulties within Black Isle's parent company, Interplay Entertainment. I'd like to extend a huge thank you at this stage to the game's two lead designers, Chris Avallone and Josh Sawyer, who were both kind enough to talk to me about their work all these years later. Avallone, in particular, also sent me a bunch of design documentation, which we're going to be showcasing throughout this video. So yes, that's where we'll start, with the initial lead designer, Chris Avallone, who had previously worked on Fallout 2, before going on to lead development for Planescape Torment, and then work on Icewind Dale 1 and 2, as well as Baldurs Gate Dark Alliance. All of that, by the way, was in the space of about 4 or 5 years. This guy doesn't really mess around. In fact, he was even busier than that, because in between work on those massive RPGs we've just mentioned, Avallone was also plotting another project. He was getting ready to return to the Wasteland. Although Interplay didn't yet have the resources to commit to a new Fallout game, at some point later down the line it would. That's what Avallone was told, and so, eager for that moment, he began work on its design. But as a solo effort, there was only so much he could do. How was he meant to properly prototype a game without a team to work with? Well, he couldn't, not really. And so he did what only an RPG designer could in that scenario. He set up an out-of-hours pen and paper game and recruited people from the studio to play through his vision of Fallout 3, but as a tabletop experience. This isn't unique to Avallone, I'm told. James Olen, the creative director for Baldurs Gate, was said to have taken plenty of inspiration from his D&D campaigns when coming up with the companion characters in that series. I asked Avallone exactly how much of the design for Fallout 3 was rooted in this pen and paper game, and this is his response.
Oh, just about everything.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So what I would do for each area is sort of like write a module about it. Like I include all like the area design documentation, reference art for the characters, reference art for the key vistas and locations. So basically, every section of the pen and paper game the players went through ended up being an area design document.
Now, if you like that anecdote, you're about to like it a whole lot more. You see, Avallone wasn't running just a single pen and paper session. There were in fact 2 separate Fallout 3 games, and they weren't even all that separate. Unbeknownst to the players, both parties existed in the same universe, and slowly over the course of both games, they would realise that the actions of the other party were starting to have repercussions on their game. This tied into a larger narrative plan for Fallout 3, which was going to feature an antagonist leading a rival party who the player would then run into throughout the course of their game. And also on a more practical level, having that many players involved in the process meant they were bringing loads of different character archetypes into Avallone's world. He would then need to accommodate for their different playstyles while designing quests and different locations. Although Fallout doesn't use a class-based system like many RPGs, Avallone did recognise that players tend to approach situations in one of 3 ways, relying either on combat, stealth, or the speech skill, and it was that last skill that he felt could use some improvement.
But one thing that's always kind of bothered me about Fallout is there's been a trend, this is going to sound really specific, a trend of using the speech skill as insta-win. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, well, I see a speech option, so I'm not even going to think about it. I'm just going to choose it because that's going to allow me to get the optimal result from this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
What I prefer, is the mechanics we were going to do for Van Buren was give you more information about the person you were talking to the longer you talked about them. Then you get to choose dialogue options that manipulate them a certain way. So, for example, it may not be a bad thing to make someone hostile because you know, based on speaking with this person, getting a sense of their psychology, what they're going to do when they get mad. And it might be to your advantage that they do that. So, seeing the red hostile response may not be a bad thing, and a speech character may actually want to guide an NPC towards that and provoke them for a certain result. But that's only because they know that through use of the speech skill.
On top of this, there were other playstyles that he wanted to accommodate for this time around, inspired by a book called Lucifer's Hammer, in which a character manages to take advantage of some advanced scientific knowledge that had been preserved from a time before the apocalypse. Avallone thought it might be fun to explore this idea of how a scientist with access to equipment and knowledge that predated the nuclear war might then be able to thrive within the Wasteland. He designed a number of questlines and locations for that kind of character type, including the Boulder Science Dome, a huge research facility that was also home to a community of scientists that had been put into stasis ahead of the nukes dropping. The very first of these scientists to wake, a genius by the name of Presper, would be the main antagonist for Fallout 3 and also the leader of that party that we mentioned earlier. In Avallone's initial outline for the story, Presper monitored the player's actions throughout the game and then decided whether or not to cleanse the entire world of human life before waking his fellow scientists based on your decisions so far. No pressure or anything. The player themselves was known as the Prisoner, as you begin the game escaping what you believe to be, at the time, a prison in the American Southwest. Interestingly, during the character creation stage, you could decide whether or not your character was rightly convicted, and so if you decided that you had in fact been a criminal, you could then select which crime you had committed. Were you a Brahmin rustler, a chem user, or a cannibal? Depending on your selection, this would then impact your starting stats. Oh, and here's another thing you would be able to select: your character's race. The Fallout 3 that we never got to play would have given the option for your character to be either a human, a ghoul, or a super mutant.
Yeah, and each of them had their own like communities and specific quests over the course of the game, and their own special traits and different perks they could choose and different limitations they had. But yeah, the fact you could play as something beyond just a human was definitely one of the goals of the game.
Avallone also had plans to reinvent the Pip-Boy in Fallout 3, allowing players to monitor the Pip-Boys worn by the other prisoners that had escaped alongside them, meaning you could then do things like read their quest logs to see where they are and what they're up to. And more than that, your Pip-Boy would also start to unlock new features and become more useful in different kinds of situations as you made your way through the game.
But you'd start getting mods and add-ons and discover new functionality if you were placed in dangerous situations. Like if you were trapped in a building and like a fire broke out, like suddenly, it's a really small example, but your Pip-Boy would suddenly wake up, let you know where all the fire exits were, where the sprinkler system was, and then suddenly you could use that functionality in any building you went into that you didn't have before. So the more you explore the environment and the more you sort of got exposed to certain situations, the more your interface would grow and expand, and we sort of wanted the interface to feel like another dungeon you were exploring over the course of the game.
So there we are, the defining principles of this Fallout game designed in pen and paper first. I love that story. God, RPGs are great. Now, Chris Avallone actually resigned from this position as lead designer on Fallout 3 at Black Isle Studios before the game was cancelled, as he went on to co-found Obsidian Entertainment. Josh Sawyer steps in as the new lead, and by now there's a full team in place that have been using Avallone's pen and paper documentation as the starting point for their work. Sawyer, it's worth knowing, had previously been the lead on another cancelled project called The Black Hound, which had eventually become Baldurs Gate 3, The Black Hound, despite Sawyer's protests that his story had very little to do with that series. Anyway, the advantage of coming off that project is that Sawyer and his team had access to and experience with a new 3D game engine. In fact, this leaked Van Buren tech demo was meant to be a reasonably accurate reflection of what the game looked like by the time it too was cancelled come the end of 2003.
I think time has made the public more aware of the development process is pretty clumsy and clunky at times, and stuff doesn't look good until the very end. So I think that over time people have become more aware of that, but actually I will say that Van Buren, that leaked demo, I would say that was probably about as good as it ever looked.
When I spoke to him, Sawyer was eager to point out that although the series was making its jump to 3D graphics here, it was vital to the team that it still felt like Fallout. This meant small touches, like for example, when you entered a building, it wouldn't load a brand new level, but rather have the roof become transparent, just like in Fallout 1 and 2. This shift from 2D sprites to 3D character models also meant features like a piecemeal armor system could be introduced. The player could equip different bits of gear, and this was then properly displayed in-game. The power armor, I'm told, was a bit of a nightmare to get right. Interestingly, Sawyer claims that games retailers were the driving force behind two of the game's big design decisions. First up, there was a pressure to drop turn-based combat entirely and replace it with something that was real-time, thanks to the success of franchises like Diablo.
That really disappointed me because I really wanted to make a turn-based game. I still want to make a turn-based game after all this time. And so I said, well, can we, Tactics had a turn-based game with like real-time with pause. Could we do something like that? And in my mind, I was just going to focus almost all of my effort on making sure the turn-based combat felt as good as it could.
And that age-old story, they also wanted the game to have some kind of multiplayer element as well.
At that point in time, there was much more pressure, again, from retailers to have co-op multiplayer in everything. I always thought it was a big waste of time because I knew the actual stats of people who played. Like even the Infinity Engine games, and you'll find people who say like, oh, I love playing co-op multiplayer. I'm like, you're one in a million people. because most people really didn't play it very long, and it's a huge amount of work. And so at that time, it was kind of a non-negotiable point that we had to have co-op multiplayer.
By the time this tech demo you're watching had been created, Sawyer said the game was realistically a bit more than a year away from completion. Unfortunately, it never made it to that stage, as Interplay faced major financial struggles and would lay off the entire staff of Black Isle Studios on the 8th of December 2003. Now, this is the second time we've properly delved into a cancelled game on Here's the Thing, after our episode earlier this year in which we looked at Human Head's Prey 2, but this story does have a slightly different ending, one with maybe a more uplifting message. Because if you played 2010's Fallout New Vegas, the Fallout game published once again by Bethesda but developed this time by Obsidian Entertainment, with Josh Sawyer as the game director and Chris Avallone as the game director for the DLC, then you will have experienced to some extent the legacy of this Fallout 3 that never was. It's set once again in the American Southwest, and there's a whole host of ideas, big and small, that made their way from that original Fallout 3 into New Vegas. The Hoover Dam, for example, was pulled straight out of Avallone's pen and paper game, although back then it was actually more of a community rather than something to be thought over. The Big Mountain Research and Development Center from Old World Blues, that's largely based on the Boulder Dome that we talked about before. Caesar's Legion, the Burned Man, these ideas had been around for years beforehand. That whole side quest with the Nightkin suffering psychological damage because of their use of stealth blaze, that quest was right out of the pen and paper session, as was Elijah, the primary antagonist of Dead Money, although back then he'd originally been a companion. Speaking of companions, here is an especially cool one to end on. Josh Sawyer, one of the game's lead designers, was also one of the players in Avallone's original tabletop campaign. In fact, he played two different characters. They would become Arcade Gannon and Jean-Baptiste Cutting. Now that I think about it, maybe I should rename the title of this video. It's not really the Fallout 3 we never played, it's more the Fallout 3 we never played until we sort of did some years later and in a different form. Yeah, it's not quite as catchy. Game cancellations can be incredibly rough things. People's lives are usually affected when they happen, and the ideas themselves, it seems, are often lost overnight, held hostage by the company that, cancelled the project, or trapped in some kind of legal battle. And I think it's great here to have a story in which, although the game itself never hit shelves, the ideas that were behind it sort of did, in a way. And yeah, Fallout New Vegas was bloody great, so there's that too. And on that note, I think we'll wrap up. Thank you for watching this week's episode of Here's the Thing. We do one every 2 weeks if you would like to watch more. I'm going to put a couple up here, including another one on Classic Fallout that I really like, which is the Fallout Sex Formula. Great episode. You can't really say that about your own work, can you? And more recently, not really to do with Here's the Thing actually, is we visited Obsidian Entertainment, had a look around the studio. I'll just put that in there as well because I feel like it might be relevant to your interests. And yeah, maybe see you in a couple of weeks time. Bye.